Good afternoon. I think the room is full. Everybody's feeling like they've got anticipation. They want to hear what's going on, so I think we'll make a start. My name's Martin Barnes. I'm the Senior Curator of Photographs at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So Shay asked me to address the idea of, the photography as an object, as a physical object. And, for me this is not unusual. It's what I deal with every day at the V&A. V&A is based on object-based research. So everything follows from the object for us. The concepts come later perhaps, but the object is king. That's everything for us. And we base our research on that and our ideas in the exhibitions primarily on object-based research. And part of what we're trying to do today is to look at explaining hybrids of photography, photo art, which might include a sculptural element or a wall-based element. And to think about the material of photography as its content. That is, the way that the processes of photography produce the concepts that make the work. And I think you'll see that in all of the artists' work that we're looking at. All of them come very strongly from a kind of photo practice, I think I'm right in saying, and a kind of use of darkroom practice to begin with. So the materiality of the photograph itself is very important to them, and that's how their work, the concepts of their work arise.
I basically start off with the whole concept and the reason why I was introduced or be invited to curate Photo50 this year. It really came from a lot of my work through Next Level magazine as editor, and my curatorial practice really looking at photography as contemporary art. So when I was asked to curate this exhibition, I instantly felt that I wanted to draw back on a certain publication, a book, actual title, Against Nature, hence the title of the exhibition, which is a novel by J.K. Huysmans. And I felt this was quite of an important publication relating to how I saw this exhibition evolving. There was similar sort of parallels of the period of when the publication was produced in the 19th century. And obviously that was the birth of photography, and how literature and photography had this kind of sort of dynamic new look at nature and new look of objects and the surroundings. And especially the character in the book, Deschentes, he isolates himself from the world and looks at his house as a kind and the object within his house. And so I saw that as a kind of sort of forerunner for the exhibition, but also I saw that as a look of where we're looking forward in terms of the way we view images today. But I really wanted to go back to something that was more visible and more tangible. And this really alludes to where the exhibition starts, and the work of one of the artists, Tom Lovelace. And almost instantly you can identify Tom's work and say, well, there's rows and waves of brooms, and what does this have to do with the kind of photographic practice? And an artist such as Tom Lovelace has looked at the history of photography, in fact Fox Talbot, and identified the open door. This was one of the earliest photographs taken. So he looked to produce a physical performance of the broom that was stacked in the open doorway of Fox Talbot's image. And also you see, he also photographed a doorway where Fox Talbot's original house, of where he took that first photograph. So there's all these different references to the physicality of the photograph as a more than just a content. Adad Hannah, and he identifies the decisive moment within the photograph, the novelty of the decisive moment. He's really interested in the way that when a photographer takes a photograph and the shutter opens, those moments, those sort of tenths of a second or even longer exposures, he likes to capture. And on the video piece, if you see, there's subtle movement of the subject within the actual piece. So he's really interested in those representations of the image that we don't actually see at the time of the actual camera taking the actual image. And Andrew Leconte is another interesting artist within the exhibition. Here he's replaced the actual sculpture with a photograph of that sculpture. So it opens up the whole discussion of how do we look at the actual sculpture and how we look at the photograph of that sculpture. Here we have Hassan Hajjaj. He takes from his life experiences, and there's a kind of almost novel way of the early stages of photography where you identify a subject, and his subjects are looking at his life experiences in London and also in Marrakesh. But then what he's looking to do is introduce a number of Arabic traditions and crafts within his works, painting over the surfaces of print, and also looking at the installation of actually the whole embodiment of the photograph actually in a space and having a kind of sort of physical entity within that space. Johnny Briggs is probably the most conventional of the artists here. So he produces latex images of his family. One of the interesting reasons why I included Johnny's works was to put on the lattice wall as you entered. You saw the back of his prints. And for me, I wanted to have that kind of identity of oscillating and walking around the actual photograph itself. The whole object was of quite of kind of heightened importance to me. And that's really where I've looked at all the artists within this exhibition, such as Giulio Galeotto, who's more conceptually based. The layers of his work within the photograph makes the photograph the object in itself.
I've got like three particular elements to the work, which I think of. One is the material photograph. That's the, sort of the paper or the mounted object, the framed object, however that comes to manifest. The actual image that's being shown, and the original object in the world. And I think the sort of work that you'll see out there is a kind of interplay or an encounter between sort of two or three of those elements, sometimes some more prominent than others. But this one's out there. This is a long image with a rock at the bottom of it, and the rock is, the paper is just sort of floating away from its kind of mount and beginning to kind of curl upwards at the bottom. And obviously this kind of just deals with the idea of the material sort of photograph and the being at odds with the image that it portrays, the weight of the rock sort of wanting to pull the photograph down. This was a large sort of installation that was shown at Unseen earlier this year, whereby the images and the frames and the lines that kind of sort of follow through from image to frame, and it's sort of thinking of the way that the physical sort of framing devices of the object can sort of impinge onto the image itself.
And for me, this really kind of pinpoints this, question of what is the actual thing? Like, what is the object of our analysis? Is it the actual contraption? Is it images of this contraption, not of which can actually quite capture it because it's constantly rotating and changing, or is it the shadows that again are mutating all the time? That led me also to think about the boundary at which something is or becomes photographic, or when it stops being such. It really boiled down to the very kind of elemental and basic things like light leaks and then just grain patterns. So just really light hitting some sort of light sensitive surface and leaving some kind of trace, and then that's incorporated into the sculptures.
And I always had a problem with photography that I'm missing the material. And that's why I started to build rooms for my pictures. As you see here, this was an option for me to bring everything together: sculptures, photography, the material. This is a piece I made just last year because I thought I can't do always rooms, it's too much work for me. But I still want to keep the idea of having a picture, a sea print, and the object. And so I was using material which is in the picture. I brought it, or I combined it with the object I was using for the sea prints. Here you also can see myself in almost you can't see myself. I became kind of a still life, so it's always me who's this figure, and I'm in the closet there, in the black closet, and my hands are sticking out. So because I had also the wish after 10 years collecting the stuff to bring this way of acting into the picture. So I was wondering how I can do pictures with the objects, with the body, but not becoming very important by myself, because I was really into the performance art from the 70s, but all those performers, they were really important as a person after a while, and you couldn't separate the work anymore from the person.
It's really great to hear the different approaches to the similar subject, but a wide variety of kind of stylistic practice and approaches, and I particularly enjoyed hearing, well, trying to distill what each of you were doing in your practice, and thinking about how Torsten is really creating a kind of immersive environment. It's about an environment that you control and you produce, and it has a particular aesthetic, and you kind of walk into it literally. And it's interesting for me, looking at the screen, it's kind of hard to work out what the artwork is, which is what Nikolai was saying in some senses. What is the actual thing? What is the artwork? Is it the assemblage you make to photograph? Is it the photograph of the assemblage? At what point do we stop, and we recognize what the artwork is? Nikolai, I really enjoyed your description of trying to work out this translation from the three-dimensional object to the two-dimensional image and back to the three-dimensional object, and really wrestling with the materiality of the photograph, and reconstituting experience was something you said, which I think a lot of this work is dealing with, is how to reenact or reconstitute an experience, which in traditional photography would be that you go out into the world, find an interesting event happening, an experiential event, and translate that in a documentary moment and produce a photograph of that. In this case, what all of you are doing are kind of reconstituting an experience to make it yourself and control it yourselves. And Darren, spoke eloquently about making objects that responded to the kind of history of photography and the history of depiction through paper, and this kind of dichotomy between the weight of the object and the weight of the paper, and trying to kind of literally cut through that sort of fourth wall of where photograph stops and where object and performance begins. So I really enjoyed hearing about all of your different approaches to that. So yeah, I guess now is the moment to sort of open out a little bit and find maybe some common territory or differences, and think about the idea of going out into the world in a traditional sense to find something that you photograph, versus tightly controlling and constructing something which comes from your own emotion or your own process to try and explain something that is reconstituting experience.
I'd probably like to say that what I felt quite interesting and drew me to the selection of these artist photographers is, I guess, obviously we all started our careers as traditional photographers in that sense, but then there came a point in everyone's decision of looking, perhaps pinning back several layers and looking at the actual physicality, the object in itself, and that transition of that object into a representation, and how we view that and how we come to a kind of understanding of the kind of what we're trying to reveal, looking at with these artists as how they're using the material as content as well. And I think that's kind of interesting in the makeup of the photographic practice, but also how the presentation becomes dimensional within a given space. And for me, that's one of the things that really interested me in the selection panel, or selecting the artist that we see on view here.
Each of you, it feels like the actual real world out there, and the events happening in that world, is insufficient to describe what you want to describe. To go there and capture it and photograph it in that kind of Henri Cartier-Bresson kind of way is just unsustainable and can't give you what you need. And is there a kind of feeling like you yearn for something you want to express, but it's not out there in the world?
I think I've personally had a very strong sense of everything. What do you photograph? Like you're saying, subject matter. I think you touched on it too. It's what on earth do you photograph? I feel like everything's photographed. You can do anything. So for me, especially being quite studio-based, I've often hit that point of thinking I've just got no idea what to actually make a photograph of anymore, or why I would make a photograph of anything, which maybe in some ways actually manipulating to some extent the objects or things in front of the camera is a way of responding to that, trying to create something or work with what exists, but bring my primarily photographic approach to something in the world and bring us together, rather than just going out and thinking I can't do sort of justice to what's out there anyway, because it looks better than I'm going to make it look in a photograph.
Right.
As part of that too, everything looks much better than I'm going to make it look. So
Yeah. So the world has already been photographed.
yeah, and it looks better than my photographs of it will look.
Right. So the world is kind of not enough, but it's also too much.
The world is a lot better than, yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that?
I can probably chime in that. I remember a few months back, I was talking about my work to somebody, and then I sort of came up with this phrase, loss of visual pleasure. So I think that a lot of my work comes from that place where, like Aaron was saying, everything's been photographed, and images they've just become stuff, really. And so that pushed me to the point where I wanted to somehow work with photography, but not with images anymore. And then, but at the same time, having come from, kind of darkroom background, there's a logical link there as well, because you're constantly getting your hands wet / dirty, and you work with a paper, and that's very physical. And then developing film is very physical, and I've always kind of flirted with destroying negatives or images and kind of bringing in that physical element. I guess that does relate to the body, and then in some ways it's a kind of phenomenological project as well. It's just like the perceptual apparatus and our kind of faculties and whatnot. And no, I don't feel that I can express that by just snapping something. Even though having said that, I occasionally kind of move over to the other. And I still sometimes produce image-based work still, which is maybe more rooted in the vernacular, but there's still a very strong formal kind of interest and connection there.
I was wondering whether this desire to get your hands dirty and physically make something is a symptom of an increasingly disembodied virtual existence.
I mean, in my case, I would say a photo is not enough, because I know a lot of great pictures, but I'm surrounded by so many materials, and I see every day we are surrounded with objects more and more, and we produce so much stuff, and the world is full of objects, and that's our religion somehow. And if I keep the three-dimensional part away, I don't know, I have the feeling something is missing. And because in my feeling I can't really reproduce that with a picture or photography, because you always have just one side of it. You can show a certain idea of it maybe, but the reality, for me, it's closer when you have the three-dimensional physical thing in the room, or added to it, or because I also made the experience when people entering the room, rooms I made, that the smell, for instance, it's very important, and the light is very important as well. And I have the same in my studio. I mean, it's not very clean, but you have this, and I like those traces of what life did put on all those objects. And so for me, it becomes more alive, even when you can do great pictures of it. Even if you can go make it really sharp and really professional with great light on it, I have the feeling still it's colder than reality somehow. And that's why I have always the need to have something close to those pictures. First, when I made my first prints, I did frame them by myself with found objects as well. That was my way to bring those things into those pieces again. So for me, it's more a photo is not enough.
I was just thinking about the idea that, I mean, photography itself has always existed in this state of being both kind of physically embodied as paper and disembodied as a negative or a digital file. So, you know, throughout its history, it's had a crisis of embodiment, you know, but it's always existed in a latent state. That's the one constant thing about it, that, you know, whether we're talking about analog or digital, it's latent, and it's a method of capture that allows you to output it in some way physically, you know, however sculpturally or three-dimensionally. So for me, looking at the entire history of photography, you know, I'm not panicked because it's always been that way. You know. But I'm wondering if perhaps we should open up to a few questions now. It's nearly 3:30.
Why has it taken photography so long to sort of come to terms with its own materiality, as it seems to be happening now?
There's always kind of almost been there in a way, you know, Man Ray with, you know, kind of sort of, you know, drawing with lights, everything. It's different, I guess there's different platforms, different areas of departure where you can attack it, whether it's in camera, on print, etc. But I feel it's always kind of had a wave and continue to be part of the photographic kind of sort of canon, but then it's not as prominent as perhaps the traditional ideas.
I was interested in, as we're in an art fair, of the notion of it just being all stuff. Who can make the best case for it not being just all stuff before anyone goes shopping?
I've seen how people who don't have money reusing objects again and again and again and again. You don't see this in Europe, this way of used objects. And you don't see, I mean, I've seen refrigerators, they were built out of 3 refrigerators. I've seen cars, they were done out of 4 cars. You couldn't tell anymore what kind of car it was. So, and this idea, if you find this in my work, I'm happy. And if someone wants to have a piece of it, I'm happy too. And, but of course, if one day I will die, someone has to take care of all the stuff. And
I'd like to thank Shay and Darren and Nikolai and Torsten, and let's go and buy some more stuff.